Okay, so this is Chapter 7, The Road to Revolution, with laser pointer, which I just figured out for the first time. This chapter is probably the most important chapter, the first 7, the one that will be most heavily covered on your upcoming test. Uh, the important thing to know with Chapter 7 is the story of why the colonies end up deciding to revolt, as opposed to just bitch to Britain. And unfortunately, it means that you're going to have to memorize a lot of the acts, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Intolerable Acts, the Quartering Act, the Quebec Act, all of those. You kind of have to even know the timeline. So it sucks, but oh well. So we start here with the first part of the chapter talks about the deep roots of revolution. And one of the vocab terms there is republicanism. And it's kind of that PC, aw shucks, we're America. You need to remember and recognize um, how great our country is, and so they kind of force feed this type of vocab term down your throats. The just society, defined as one in which all citizens willingly subordinated their private, selfish interests to the common good. Both the stability of society and the authority of government thus depended on the virtue of the citizenry. Now, the ironic thing is this goes completely against Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which talks about that the private greed of individuals and everybody pursuing their selfish interests is actually good for the country. But I guess that's a question for government. The Radical Whigs, they were a party in England, and they feared the threat to liberty posed by the arbitrary power of the monarch and his ministers to elected representatives in Parliament. The monarchy in Britain is kind of a unique monarchy in that it, it started out not even as a complete monarchy. When William the Conqueror invaded England and took it over, there wasn't a whole lot of Normans there, and so he needed help from the nobles. And so he he created this tradition where he would consult these nobles for their help, for their money, for their soldiers, and in return the nobles wanted a piece of the action. That slowly evolves into the nobles being members of parliament and the king having to do some things with the nobles. So then you get the Magna Carta in the 1200s. You get what's called the Bill of Rights, although it looks very, very different than our Bill of Rights in the 1680s. I believe it was 1688. And this was at the time we had all the civil war between Parliament and the King. And you had Oliver Cromwell, who was the Prime Minister, and they had the King beheaded. And there was a short amount of time where Parliament in the 1600s was the only ruling power until they eventually put the king back into place, but the king didn't have as much power as Parliament. And so this is where you get this idea of radical Whigs, and that it's okay to fight against arbitrary monarchical power. In addition to that, Americans had well over 100 years of they were used to being pretty much on their own, where Great Britain, as long as they were getting their cash, as long as the boats kept going to London to drop off the trade from America, they didn't really care if Americans were acting American and not like loyal British subjects. All right, mercantilism. This vocab term is on every single AP test, so you need to know what it is. And it's basically an economic system that's not purely capitalist. It's almost like a predecessor to capitalism. And what you have is a mother country, a host nation, in other words, and hopefully for the host nation it has a bunch of colonies. And what the host country tries to do is suck all of the wealth out of those countries, of those colonies, I'm sorry. And what it really means is to pull all of the gold and the silver, because that's what you turn into money. So you take that gold and silver, you bring it to the mother country. In addition to that, you pull out any of the natural resources, whether it be lumber, fish, minerals, and really anything. And you bring it to the mother country, and at this time, Great Britain was starting to go through their industrial revolution, so they would turn these raw materials into finished goods. We'll say it's like a pot-bellied stove, or pots and pans, guns, or something like that. And then you would sell the finished goods back to the citizens of your colonies. So you were always sucking the wealth out of the colonies, no matter what. whether it be getting the raw materials from them or you're having guaranteed markets to sell your goods at. And so Great Britain did that throughout the world for most of the 17, 16, 17, 18, and even into the 1900s. And they of course did it to the United States. And, well, we didn't like it after a while. This probably forms the biggest grievance that the Founding Fathers had. Most of the Founding Fathers were somehow involved with trade overseas. And they didn't like that in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, that Great Britain started to enforce the Navigation Acts. With the Navigation Acts, they're the teeth, they're the police force, really, of the idea of mercantilism. And so when Great Britain started to say, hey, you cannot deal with the French, you cannot deal with the West Indies, you can only deal with Great Britain, and we had a big problem with that. And so here I had the bullet points: all commerce flowing to and from the colonies was to be transported only in British vessels. This obviously is going to hurt American vessels. European goods destined for America first had to be landed in Britain, where tariff duties could be collected and British middlemen could take a slice of the profits. Of course, American goods are going to cost more. Currency shortage in the colonies. Under the idea of mercantilism, if you're pulling all the gold and the silver out of the colonies, it's tough to have currency. And then, of course, what the colonies try and do, they try and create paper money then. And what does Parliament answer? Parliament answers by prohibiting colonial legislators from printing paper money or bankruptcy laws. So if you're in the colonies, you're kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. They're not giving you, you're not allowed to keep, I should say, your gold and silver coins, and at the same time, Britain is forbidding you from using paper money. So there's really nothing left. This is just an illustration of the fight between Great Britain and America. America is, of course, depicted as the topless Indian woman there. Very nice. Great Britain is depicted as the queen. This is a picture of Paul Revere, looking very thoughtful. He was a silversmith, silver engraver. He becomes obviously legend in the middle of the. Okay, so the stamp tax uproar. So George Grenville is the British Prime Minister in 1763. You got to remember, at this time, the Prime Minister is probably slightly more powerful than the King. At this point, the Parliament had taken over power to a large degree in Great Britain. Not total power like it has today, but to a large degree. So George Grenville is essentially the most powerful person in Britain at the time. And if he ends the period of salutary neglect, the British strictly begin enforcing the Navigation Acts. And then in addition to that, they passed two acts, 1764 and 1765. The Sugar Act, the first one, is the first law ever passed for the sole purpose of raising tax revenue in the colonies for the crown. They'd increased the tax on foreign sugar imported from the West Indies. So, of course, the colonists who had really never been taxed before by Great Britain, they weren't used to this, and they were extremely pissed. In addition, the Quartering Act of 1765 required certain colonies to provide food and quarters for British troops. This is going to be different than the later Quartering Act, and different than the Third Amendment that America passes. This Quartering Act, Britain is forced to have, not forced, but they decided to have British soldiers in the colonies to a greater extent in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, basically to guard against future French and Indian attacks. Remember, there's Pontiac's Rebellion also in this aftermath. So they need to pay for them. So the Sugar Act helps pay for the soldiers' salaries and all the upkeep and all the transportation costs. And they're also requiring the colonial governments to raise funds and to perhaps create barracks or camps to provide for the food and the housing for these British soldiers. So these British soldiers at this time period are not staying in individual American homes. It's just that the colonial governments have to foot the bill for them. The Stamp Act. This is probably the most heavily tested of the acts and probably the most well known. said the Tea Act. It was passed in 1765, and it was also passed to raise revenue to support the British soldiers in America. It basically meant that anybody had to purchase some sort of like a stamp, like you would put on an envelope today, and it's on all bills of sale, which is a contract, all legal documents like wills and marriage licenses, and contracts, playing cards, which you guys know, pamphlets, and newspapers, etc. Obviously, this is going to raise the cost of all this stuff, and once again, the Americans are not used to this, and so they're extremely hostile to the notion of having to pay for a stamp act. It also kind of raises the specter of that the British government would get first glance at all this type of stuff and possibly be able to edit it if it wanted to or censor it. If you think about it, this was a stupid idea by the British, because by requiring the use of these stamps on all newspapers, all these newspapers who are already imprinted in America, whether they be to the far left, to the far right, or early versions of tabloids, they're pretty much going to be all together in perfect unison in their hostility towards the Stamp Act, because it's going to raise the price of newspapers. So the British lose the PR campaign already at the outset, because everyone in America is going to be pissed off at these stamps, and the entire press is also going to be pissed off at these stamps. Another act that's passed is about admiralty courts. It basically says it gives some teeth to the Navigation Act. So violators of the Sugar and Stamp Acts were tried in admiralty courts. These were courts where there were no juries of your peers, which Americans were used to, and instead of being innocent until proven guilty, it was just the opposite. You were guilty until proven innocent. And unlike today, where the prosecution has to prove the case, in these admiralty courts, the defendant actually had to prove his. So what happens? America basically starts to form alliances with each other. The different colonies start to have meetings. The first one that's of significance is the Stamp Act Congress, which happens the same year as its passage, 1767. You get 27 delegates from 9 of the 11 colonies meet. We are way before the idea of revolution, and so instead they basically draw up their statement of what they believe their rights as Englishmen, not Americans, what their rights as Englishmen are, their grievances, and they basically ask the king and parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. What the Americans do, which is a little more ballsy, is they start a boycott against British goods. These are called non-importation agreements. So fighting against the importation of British goods. And these actually, as is most cases of world and American history, the economic hurt that Britain suffers is actually what probably causes far more things to happen than these other declaratory writings and stuff like that from the Stamp Act. What you also start to see are the formation of, and I guess you could almost call them terrorist groups. Obviously, it's a big stigma using that term. And I'm actually saying that we had American versions of them. But if you think about what they do, they're essentially the early formation of a rebel group. But the tactics that they use, they're terrorist tactics. So the two biggest ones are Sons of Liberty, which were men, and the Daughters of Liberty, which were women. They enforced these non-importation agreements. So if anybody was breaking these agreements, then the guys from the Sons of Liberty would knock on their door and try and intimidate them into stop doing business with the British. In addition to that, officials who worked with the British, like tax collectors and guys who sold the stamps and stuff like that, they were prone to basically have their houses broken into, all their stuff stolen, have their houses set on fire, have themselves dragged out, tarred, feathered, and hung. So it is kind of like a terrorist group and activities that they were doing. Because let's face it, those tax collectors were just doing their jobs. So based on all of this stuff, Britain eventually repeals the act because the economy was hurt by all these non-importation agreements. And actually, you could trace the earliest roots, really, of American industry to this time period. it's going to happen again in American industry, and the Industrial Revolution really starts in America during the War of 1812, essentially for the exact same reasons. But you can even trace the antecedent to those, to this time period where America is forced for the first time to start their own manufacturing because, frankly, they can't buy British goods. Remember, under mercantilism, the British won't even let them make their own manufactured goods. So this would be an early version of a manufactured good, a tea kettle, and in addition to that, the design on it is very political based. There's no stamp act. The one American. I guess this is probably the other side of the same tea kettle. Here is a political cartoon from the time period where it shows the Sons of Liberty tarring, feathering, pouring scalding hot tea down this British tax collector's mouth. Maybe it's an American tax collector working for the British. You can see in the background there the Tea Party is obviously going on, which we'll talk about in a minute. And more ominously, that the Liberty Tree in the background, with of course the noose hanging from the limb, where the guy whose throat is now burnt to hell is about ready to suffer some more damage to that neck. Okay, so the Townsend Tea Tax and the Boston Massacre, two of the more memorable events during this time period. Obviously, they're heavily tested on the AP test. Charles Townsend, he's a member of Parliament. His title, his position is called Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is, if you were to compare it to an American title, it would be Secretary of the Treasury. So in other words, this guy is in charge of the money in Great Britain and to pass different acts. So obviously Britain still has all these debts from the French and Indian War. They're still all pissed off that the Stamp Act doesn't work. And so Charlie Townsend, his nickname was Champagne Charlie Townsend because he was drunk, he persuades Parliament in 1767 to pass what are called the Townsend Acts. Obviously they're named after him. And so you get new taxes on glass, lead, paper, paint, and the all-important tea. What they tried to do, though, is they tried to be a little sneaky. Instead of Americans themselves having to pay for the taxes, these were taxes on customs duties. So in other words, they were an indirect tax. So the ship would actually go to America, and then the middleman there, right at the dock, would have to pay the tax. So you'd have the customs house, right? There's customs at airports nowadays, where sometimes if you're bringing goods in at the airport, you have to pay the tax on it. It's essentially the same idea. So you go to the port of Boston with a boatload of tea, and the customs official is going to board the boat, and he's going to see how much tea is on board. And he's going to tell the boat owner, all right, you owe X number of dollars. So then whoever buys that tea then is going to have to pay a slightly higher price to the boat owner, and then the price is going to trickle down to the American consumers, but they're not going to directly pay the tax on every single cup of tea that they buy. So this was kind of a shady move by Great Britain in general and Townsend in particular. And once again, it was meant to pay for British officials in America. Specifically in this part, though, and this was something that was new, to pay for the salaries of the royal governors, which you remember we talked about before, that the colonial legislatures had a certain amount of power over the royal governors because they actually paid his salary. Well, this was meant to break away the royal governors from the purse strings of the colonial legislatures. In addition to that, it was meant to pay judges in America. Of course, these were British judges. So you can see what Britain's trying to do here. They're trying to give the British government forces in America more independence from the Americans themselves. And what's the best way to do that? Send more soldiers to police the joint. So Britain also sends 2 regiments of British troops into Boston in 1768 to enforce these acts. Now these soldiers, when they're on their off days or when they're not working, they get side jobs. And in Boston during this time period, most of the time this is a dock worker, loading ships, unloading ships. And I'm not going to bore you with the details of how the Boston Massacre originates, but there was this rope factory, and the American owner of the rope factory refused to hire British soldiers, to work there. And so the British soldiers gave him a hard time, and there was some small-scale fights between this rope manufacturers, American workers, and British soldiers. And of course, then as fights tend to do over the days and weeks, they keep building and building and building. And so what happens then is on March 5th, 1770, at the British Customs House. So remember, this is the official who would be in charge of boarding the ships and assessing the tax. A mob of angry Americans um, starts throwing rocks and yelling at the British soldiers who were guarding the customs house. Uh, the mob of Americans was far larger than the soldiers, and there's different accounts, but it does seem that the American mob was they're throwing stuff at the soldiers, and the soldiers got freaked out and they got scared. Um, Somebody, no one probably knows who, British soldier ends up taking the first shot. The other British soldiers hear that shot, thinking that they're getting shot at, perhaps, and so they fire into the crowd, and they kill or wound 11 citizens. So this is an absolute nightmare, really, for all. Here's the famous uh, engraving, actually made by Paul Revere, of the British soldiers firing into the mob there. So this is the Boston Massacre. This one was your textbook shows how history changes over time. This is a redo basically of the Paul Revere writing, but at this point, this one was made in the 1840s or 50s, I can't remember, but in the height of the abolitionist movement. And whereas in the previous slide, you don't see Crispus Attucks, the black guy who was killed. Here, he's the main character, and he looks like he's about ready to get bayoneted in the neck. So you can see how this is a very like Zen Schweikart type of thing, where in the first case, you don't see Crispus Attucks at all. But here, obviously, the abolitionists are trying to say that African Americans took a huge part in the founding of America, and that Crispus Attucks was the first black martyr in American history. So, what happens after all this? So the Boston Massacre becomes a huge PR stunt where Sam Adams, who's John Adams' distant cousin, kind of orchestrates the local Sons of Liberty to have huge protests, and they have a funeral for the victims of Boston Massacre, and the people who show up for the funeral like actually exceed, I think, the total population of Boston at that time. It's like a big deal. Britain is forced to basically back down for a little bit, and so you have here the new Prime Minister, Lord North. He repeals the Townshend Acts, except for the tax on tea. Now, they thought that this would appease the Americans, but it doesn't, and it doesn't in part because it's almost like it's gone too far. Things are spiraling towards revolution at this point, and any perceived slight is really blown way out of proportion on both sides, to be honest with you. And so here you have Sam Adams, who at this point, every single day, now he is pushing and pushing and pushing towards independence. He forms the committees of correspondence in Boston, which was basically the Sons of Liberty, that they would just kind of hang out in his brewery and talk about how much they hated the British, and, under, of course, probably a few brews, and then try and stash gunpowder and guns in different places around Boston, and write secret messages to committees of correspondence in different colonies, trying to get them to do the same. But what you get here is kind of the first intercolonial kind of clandestine unity, and the glue for that unity is hatred towards Britain. And it really starts to shift at this point from just being pissed off Englishmen and wanting Britain to change their ways to being pissed off Americans who want a clean break with Britain. These committees of correspondence end up evolving into the first American Congresses. Now you're going to see the same people who were in these committees end up being the same guys who were in the first Congresses. There's Sam Adams. I don't know if the artist is just bad or what, but he's got this huge belly and it looks like tiny little arms. So he's got little midget arms or something. More tea, more Boston. So the British East India Tea Company is essentially a monopoly, a government sanctioned monopoly. In fact, lots of members of the Parliament actually owned stock in the British East India Tea Company, and so they wanted to see its success. Well, of course, it's not being successful. It's almost going bankrupt. And so the British government tries to help it out. So they granted a monopoly in the American tea business in 1773. So the tea tax remains, but the company now is allowed is not only allowed, is the only place to buy the tea in Boston or the rest of America for that matter. So it cuts out all of the middlemen, which of course in America that's going to destroy the livelihoods of anybody who is involved in the tea trade. And who is one of the biggest smugglers of items, including tea, is a guy by the name of John Hancock. In addition to that, you got Sam Adams, who now is just basically saying this is yet another attempt by the British to force a tax down our throats, to put their boot on our throats, force us to do what they want, as opposed to us seeking our livelihoods on our own. The ironic thing is, by cutting out all the middlemen, the British East India Tea Company is going to be able to sell tea for very, very cheap. In fact, cheaper even than any of the American smugglers could sell their tea. But the Americans would rather pay higher prices for smuggled tea than cheap tea with tax from Great Britain. And so, of course, this culminates in the Boston Tea Party on December 16th, 1773. We get about 100 people dressed as Indians who board British East India ships and throw the tea in the ocean. Obviously, Britain does not handle this well, and they pass a series of penalty laws. This is a scene from the book of the Boston Tea Party. Here you can see them dressed like Indians. Very exciting. So, what Britain's response is the Intolerable Acts passed in 1774. First one's the Port Act, which closed the Boston harbor for all ships coming in or coming out of the harbor until Boston paid for the damages to the British East India Tea Company. The Government Act, which placed a bunch of restrictions on town meetings. It was an attempt to stop the New England town meetings from having their bitch sessions about Britain. The Administration of Justice Act, where British officials who killed colonists would be sent to Britain for trial. Now, if you're an American, you're going to be very pissed off about this, because what this means is a British soldier could kill your brother, we'll say. And even if everybody saw it, that British soldier would not be arrested and tried in America, where there would be American witnesses and American juries to determine his guilt or innocence. This British soldier would be sent to Britain, and of course, where are the witnesses going to be? So this raises the specter that the British could kill with impunity and never be found guilty, and they're probably right to be honest with you. The Quartering Act. So here is now a new Quartering Act. It gives local authorities the power to lodge British soldiers anywhere, even in private homes. So now you have these British officials who are now independent of colonial legislatures, and they can just take a squad of British soldiers, point to a house, and say, that house is now yours. You stay there for as long as you want. And the Americans who lived in that house, they get the boot, or they gotta make room. So you can imagine this completely destroys the sanctity of your home, and it creates such an uproar that even well after the Revolutionary War, when we get to 1790, and the people of America want to prevent this from happening, and it culminates in the Third Amendment, which has really never been an issue ever in American history. Probably the most egregious one, and it has nothing even to do with the Boston Tea Party, is the Quebec Act, and it's not even meant for America. You remember that Canada is conquered, right, and given to Great Britain in the French and Indian War. It just happens that there's this big French minority there. We already talked about the Acadians who become the Cajuns. But in that Quebec region there, which is basically, the St. Lawrence Seaway area there, there's large French people, or large French population. And they had their own French customs. And so the British, actually are being nice to the French people who are living in Canada, and they pass this act which allows them to retain a bunch of their traditional customs. So they're guaranteed their Catholic religion. They're permitted to retain their old customs and institutions, which included a representative assembly, which did not include a representative assembly or trial by jury. And the boundaries of Quebec were extended south and west, actually into the much coveted Ohio River Valley and Great Lakes region. Now, if you're an American, first off, remember it's a Protestant country. They hate the Catholics. They view this as just yet another precedent to get rid of assemblies, democratic assemblies, remember the Government Act, and trial by jury, remember the Admiralty Act. And how did the French and Indian War start, remember, with George Washington surveying the Ohio River Valley, and these colonies, many of the colonists had land or title to land or hoped to have land in the Ohio River Valley, and now this is being cut off completely because it's given to Quebec. So it just had the misfortune of being kind of lumped in with these Intolerable Acts for Britain, but it really inflames the hatred of the Americans now towards Britain. Here's just a map showing the Quebec Act. You can still see there it's got the Indian Reserve in the west, Quebec's boundaries in the north, and then that blue outline there was the Quebec after 1774. So you can see how much larger the boundaries of Quebec were actually enlarging down in there to what, in fact, here in Illinois, all of Illinois would have been contained in Quebec under the Quebec Act. So the First Continental Congress, 1774, it meets to consider ways of addressing colonial grievances. They formed a committee called the Association, which called for a complete boycott of British goods, non-importation, non-exportation, and not even any consumption of goods. It also brings us to the first, true battle of the Revolutionary War, which occurs still, remember, a whole year before the Declaration of Independence. But Lexington and Concord in 1775. So British troops, they hear that the Americans are hiding some gunpowder and some weapons in Lexington and Concord, and they think that Sam Adams and John Hancock are actually hiding there. Because obviously, once all those soldiers come, Adams and Hancock are basically on the run. So you've heard the stories growing up about the Minutemen and all that other stuff, and on the green and all that stuff. Well, the American soldiers, they lost. I mean, you had this line of Americans, you had this line of British soldiers. They start shooting, and the Americans were forced to flee. The issue is, though, that the British, who had to march all the way back to Boston, the entire march, you have Americans hiding in the forest taking pot shots at them. And so the Americans actually kill far more British soldiers than the British killed Americans, but it was all kind of guerrilla warfare type tactics. There's Concord. Helps that. And here's the last slide. So you see, let's go all the way to 1763, where you have the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War ends. This is when Britain decides to enforce the Navigation Acts, and pass new acts to raise revenue. 1764, the Sugar Act. 1765, the Quartering Act, the Stamp Act. You get the Stamp Act Congress for America's response. The Declaratory Act, Townshend Acts in 1767. British troops occupied Boston in 68. The Boston Massacre in 1770. All the Townshend Acts except for the Tea Acts are repealed. The committees of correspondence are formed in 1772. 1773, this is when the British East India Company is granted the tea monopoly. Boston Tea Party occurs then. In 1774, you get the Intolerable Acts and the Quebec Act. You get the First Continental Congress, where you have another complete boycott of British goods and not even a consumption of British goods. And then the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775. And that's it for the year.